October 1247. In the village of Ashford on the edge of the Chiltern Hills in southern England, every family with strips in the common field had already brought in their grain and sealed their root cellars before the first hard frost. Every family except one. While his neighbors packed their turnips and cabbages into the usual shallow pits lined with straw, a villager named Edmund spent the better part of 3 weeks digging. His pit was not the standard 2 feet deep that custom demanded. By the time he finished, it measured 5 feet from the surface to the floor, 4 feet wide, lined not with loose straw, but with a tight-packed wall of rye chaff mixed with clay, and covered with a double lid of split oak, fitted with an air vent no wider than a man's thumb. His neighbors watched from their doorways. The work was unnecessary. The work was wasteful. A man called out from across the strip boundary that Edmund was digging his own grave before winter even arrived. The laughter carried across the field. Edmund's storage pit had taken 20 days and cost him nearly a full week of his own labor that could have gone to other autumn tasks. The standard pit that every other villager used required 2 days to dig and 1 to line. His neighbors had moved on to slaughtering their autumn pigs, salting pork, and spreading manure on the exhausted strips before the ground froze. The village reeve, a man named Geoffrey, who had managed the Lord's fields for 15 years and knew the land as well as any man in the county, rode past on his inspection of the common and stopped to look at Edmund's work. "That's a hole for storing grain, not a castle keep," he said. "Your neighbors have theirs done and sealed. What are you doing that takes 3 weeks?" Edmund did not offer a long explanation. He described the wall thickness, the clay seal, and the air vent. The reeve shook his head and moved on. What did this one villager understand about root vegetables, temperature, humidity, and the slow chemistry of winter storage that every other family in Ashford had missed? If you want to hear stories about practical knowledge that genuinely made the difference between eating and starving, stay with this one. It is worth the time. The Valley of Ashford in 1247 sat in a part of England that knew hard winters, but did not typically face the killing cold of the far north. The Chilterns provided some shelter. The village had existed long enough that its storage customs had been refined over generations. Nobody in living memory had questioned the 2-foot pit lined with straw. The old people said it had always been done that way, and that was sufficient reason to continue. Edmund was not from Ashford originally. He had come to the village 8 years earlier as a young man, having spent his adolescence working in the household of a monastic granary at Abingdon, roughly 20 miles to the west. The monastery stored grain in bulk on a scale that individual peasant families could not match, and the monks who managed the granary had accumulated practical knowledge about spoilage, temperature management, and the behavior of root vegetables in cold storage that village custom had never needed to develop. Brother Anselm, the monk responsible for the granary cellars, had explained the principles to Edmund in plain terms over several harvests. Cold air sinks, warm air rises. A shallow pit exposed to the outside through a poorly fitted lid loses its internal temperature every time the lid is lifted and every time the outside air drops below freezing. Vegetables left in fluctuating temperatures do not simply freeze and then survive. They partially freeze, partially thaw, and then rot from the inside. The damage is invisible until the turnip is cut open, by which point it is already inedible. The monastery's deep storage cellars maintained a temperature that varied by only a few degrees across the entire winter, regardless of what happened above ground. The key was depth, mass, and controlled ventilation. Edmund had watched this work across 4 winters at Abingdon. He had seen the monastery's stored roots emerge in March, still firm and edible, while the village cellars in the surrounding area were already half rotted by February. He had asked questions, and Brother Anselm had answered them, because a useful laborer who understands why he is doing something does better work than one who simply follows instructions. When Edmund left the monastery's service to marry and take up a strip in Ashford, he brought this knowledge with him. For the first few years, he had tried to apply it with the resources available to a peasant, with minimal tools and no authority over common practice. His results had been modest improvements over the standard method, but not dramatic enough to draw attention. In 1247, his 3rd daughter had been born in late September, and he had made a decision that the winter that year would not be the one where his family ate the seed grain. The standard storage pit in an English village of the 13th century was not a careless piece of work. Generations of observation had produced a method that functioned adequately in normal years. A hole roughly 2 feet deep, perhaps 3 feet wide, lined with a thick layer of dry straw, filled with root vegetables, and covered with a wooden board weighted down with earth and more straw. The straw provided insulation against the coldest nights. The wood cover kept out the worst of the rain and snow. In a mild winter, this worked well enough. Root vegetables kept through to February or early March. A family could survive the hungry months before spring planting if they had started with sufficient harvest and the winter did not extend past its usual length. The problem was that adequate performance in normal years had prevented anyone from examining what happened in bad ones. When the pit failed, the explanation was always the same. The winter was too hard, the cold too deep, the snow too heavy. The pit itself was never the problem. The method was never questioned because failure was attributed to exceptional circumstances rather than fundamental design. Edmund had spent 8 years in Ashford watching this reasoning operate. He had seen 2 difficult winters in that time, one in 1241 and one in 1244, where families in the village had been forced to slaughter their breeding animals in February to avoid starvation when their root cellars ran short. The village had recovered each time. The following years had been good harvests, and the memory of the lean months faded. Nobody drew conclusions. His own shallow pits in those early years had not performed dramatically differently from his neighbors. The difference in depth was only a foot or so, and he had not yet applied the clay seal or the controlled vent. He had been constrained by time and by the social pressure not to appear to be doing something that nobody else in the village did. In 1247, he made no announcement. He simply began digging in early October when the harvest was in, and he kept digging past the depth where anyone else would have stopped. The dimensions of Edmund's pit were not arrived at arbitrarily. They came from the measurements Brother Anselm had used in the monastery cellar, scaled down to what one man with a spade and his oldest son could execute in the time available before the ground hardened. 5 feet of depth placed the floor of the pit at a level where the surrounding earth maintained a stable temperature throughout winter. Above 2 feet, the soil temperature follows the air temperature with a delay of days. Below 3 feet, the delay extends to weeks. Below 5 feet in English chalk country, the soil temperature in winter hovers between 2 and 5 degrees above freezing, and moves very slowly in either direction, regardless of surface conditions. This is not a property of any particular place. It is a function of the thermal mass of the Earth itself, which absorbs and releases heat slowly enough that the surface fluctuations of winter and summer do not penetrate more than a few feet within a single season. Brother Anselm had not described this in the terms a natural philosopher would have used. He had described it in the terms of a man who had watched vegetables keep and spoil across 30 winters. Below a certain depth, things stay cold and stay the same. Above that depth, things get cold and then warm up and then get cold again. And that movement is what kills the roots. The 4-foot width was a practical decision. Wider pits were harder to cover tightly, and a tight cover was essential. The clay and rye chaff mixture that lined the walls served two purposes. It blocked the movement of moisture from the surrounding soil into the pit's interior, and it added thermal mass to the walls, slowing the response of the pit's internal temperature to any change in the outside conditions. The air vent was the detail that his neighbors found most peculiar and most wasteful of effort. A thumb-width hole fitted with a plug of twisted wool that could be opened or closed. The reeve had asked why a man would put a hole in a storage pit, and Edmund had answered that without one. The pit would build up gases from the vegetables themselves that accelerated rot. This was knowledge from the monastery, observed rather than understood in any theoretical sense, but reliable. The double oak lid, fitted together with a clay seal around the joint, was the most expensive part of the construction. Edmund had spent 2 days splitting and fitting the oak, which was time he did not have to spare. The single-board covers his neighbors used let in cold air every time they flexed in the frost. His fitted lid stayed sealed. The first test came not in winter, but in November, when the early cold arrived harder than usual. A sharp frost in the second week of November drove temperatures below freezing for 10 consecutive nights, something that happened in some years, but not all. The villagers who had stored their roots in standard pits found when they opened them in late November to take out the weak supply that the outer layer of vegetables had already begun to show soft spots where partial freezing had started the process of decay. This was not unusual. The experienced households knew to sort through their stored roots each time they opened the pit, removing any that showed signs of damage before the rot could spread. It was an accepted part of winter storage management. You expected some losses. You planned for them by storing more than you thought you would need. Edmund's pit, when he opened it for the first time in late November, showed no such damage. The roots were as firm as they had been on the day he stored them. The interior temperature was cold, but uniform. The air vent, which he had kept plugged during the worst of the frost, had been opened briefly on the 3 mildest days of November to allow a small exchange of air, then plugged again. He did not advertise this. He took out what his family needed and closed the lid. His neighbor to the north, a man named Robert who kept the strips immediately adjacent to Edmund's, had noticed that Edmund's pit was still sealed, while his own was already open and in use, and asked about it. Edmund answered honestly. Robert listened, nodded, and said that 5 feet seemed excessive work for results you could not see from the outside. By December, Robert had lost roughly a quarter of his stored roots to the spreading rot that followed the November frost. This was within the range he expected. A bad winter ate a quarter of your stores. A very bad winter ate half. You managed it, by reducing portions. The children ate less. The adults ate less. You survived. Edmund's family ate full portions through December. January of 1248 brought the conditions that made that winter the subject of memory for the next generation. The freeze arrived on the 6th day of the new year and did not break for 40 days. Snow accumulated to a depth of 2 feet in the valley by mid-January, and then froze solid on top, so that the crust would support a man's weight without breaking. The river at the valley bottom slowed to a crawl under the ice. Livestock that could not be brought into shelter died. 2 of the village's oxen, kept in a poorly constructed byre on the eastern edge of the common, froze where they stood. The cold reached levels that the oldest people in Ashford said they had not seen in their lifetimes. No numbers were recorded. The experience of it was recorded later in a manorial account that noted simply that it was the coldest January in memory, and that the village required emergency grain from the Lord's reserve to survive until spring. That emergency grain distribution tells the story more clearly than any description of suffering. The village collectively ran short of food in early February, 6 weeks before spring planting could begin to provide any supplementary nutrition. Families whose root cellars had seemed adequate in October were exhausted by the sustained cold and the length of the winter. Children lost weight. An elderly man died in early February in circumstances the priest's records attribute to cold and hunger together. Edmund's family did not receive any of the emergency grain distribution. When the reeve made his circuit in February to assess which families needed support from the Lord's reserve, he recorded Edmund's household as having sufficient provisions. Edmund opened his pit for the reeve's inspection. The roots inside were still firm. Not all of them, and some of the outermost layer had suffered some softening, but the majority, protected by depth and mass and the sealed lid, had maintained integrity through 40 days of sustained freeze that had broken the standard pits across the village. The reeve stood at the edge of the pit for some time. He had been managing storage crises for 15 years. He had distributed emergency grain in 1241 and 1244. He had never seen a villager's private storage pit come through a hard winter in this condition. He asked Edmund to explain what he had done. Edmund explained it the same way Brother Anselm had explained it to him. Depth, mass, seal, controlled vent. He used plain words and referred to what he had observed rather than to any theoretical account of why it worked. The reeve listened without interrupting. When Edmund finished, the reeve asked why he had not told the village about this before. Edmund said he had not been asked. The February of 1248 stripped away the arguments that might otherwise have persisted for years. When people are hungry and their neighbors are not, they pay attention to what the difference is. The emergency grain distribution, which was recorded and remembered, attached a specific cause and effect to Edmund's methods in a way that could not be dismissed as exceptional circumstances. His pit had not succeeded because his harvest had been larger. The strips in the common field were allocated and worked in ways that produced roughly comparable yields across households. His pit had succeeded because of how he stored what he harvested. Robert, who had lost more than half his stores by February and had received emergency grain to cover the difference, came to Edmund in early February while the ground was still frozen and asked him to explain the construction in detail. Edmund walked him through it from memory including the dimensions, the lining method, the lid fitting, and the vent placement. Robert asked how long it had taken. Edmund told him 20 days, most of it digging. Robert said that was 3 times the work he had put into his own pit, and that he had not believed it was worth the time in October. Edmund did not say anything in response to this. Robert asked whether Edmund would help him build a proper pit when the ground thawed in spring, to have it ready for the next harvest. Edmund said he would. The reeve, who had his own authority over the management of the village's collective resources, made a different kind of request. He asked Edmund to be present at the autumn storage preparations that year, and to explain his methods to the village as a whole during the period when the pits were being dug. This was not a formal change in village practice. There was no written instruction, no Lord's directive, no change in custom as recorded in any document. It was the reeve using the informal authority of his position to direct knowledge toward a practical problem. Emergency grain distributions came out of the Lord's reserve, which meant they reduced what was available for other purposes and created obligations that the village would be expected to repay in labor or kind. The reeve had an economic reason to prevent the situation from repeating. Spring came slowly in 1248. The snow held in the upper parts of the Chilterns into April, and the planting season started late. The village was behind in its work before it began, still managing the after effects of the winter's losses. The 2 dead oxen had to be replaced with animals borrowed from the neighboring manor at a cost in future labor that would constrain the village's resources for the following 2 years. Edmund's contribution to the spring recovery was practical rather than dramatic. He helped Robert design and begin excavating his new pit in April, using the same specifications Edmund had used for his own. He answered questions from other villagers who had heard about the reeve's assessment and come to see what was different about the storage that had survived the winter. Most of them expressed the same initial response. 5 feet was too much work. The time investment required to build a proper pit consumed days that could not be spared during the compressed window between harvest and the onset of winter cold. A family with limited labor and multiple competing demands on their autumn time could not simply decide to spend 3 weeks on a storage pit when the standard pit could be completed in 2 days. Edmund's answer to this was consistent. He did not argue about what the proper pit was worth in terms of insurance against bad years. He offered instead a modification of the method that could be achieved in less time. 4 feet of depth rather than 5 provided most of the benefit with roughly half the labor. A simpler clay seal on a standard width pit, while not as effective as the full construction, represented a meaningful improvement over bare straw. The fitted double lid required a day of carpentry work that most households could find somewhere in the autumn schedule. The message was that any improvement in the direction of depth and seal was worth more than none, and that the full method, while the best available, was not the only application of the principle. This was the practical wisdom that spread through Ashford, and from Ashford into the network of villages connected by kinship, trade, and the movement of seasonal labor. Not the full method as Edmund had built it, but the principle behind it. Depth controls, temperature, mass stabilizes it, a tight seal holds it, and the work put into construction before winter is directly recovered in what is still edible when February arrives. The documentation of what happened in Ashford in 1247 and 1248 is indirect. No chronicle of the period recorded the name of a peasant storage pit. The evidence survives in fragments. The manorial accounts that record the emergency grain distribution, and the fact that not all households in the village required it. The priest's burial records for the winter of 1248, and a single entry in the reeve's memorandum book, preserved by the monastery at Abingdon in a collection of estate management documents that refers to a villager's storage method and notes that it was to be recommended to other estates. That entry, 3 sentences in a working document rather than any formal report, is the closest thing to a contemporary record of what Edmund did. The reeve described the method briefly, attributed it to a villager who had learned it from the monastery's granary practice, and recommended it as a cost to the village in labor that was returned in reduced grain reserve consumption. The reeve was not recording history. He was writing a practical note to himself or to whoever might read his management records after him. The fact that the note exists at all suggests that he considered the knowledge worth preserving and passing on. Brother Anselm at Abingdon had kept records of the monastery's storage methods in rather more detail, as part of the granary management documentation that was a standard part of monastic administration. Those records describe the deep cellars, the temperature observations, the methods for controlling humidity through ventilation, and the comparative outcomes for different storage configurations. The monastery had been refining these methods for several generations by the time Edmund worked there as a young man. What Edmund did was not invent anything new. He transferred a practice from one context to another, from a large institutional granary to a single family storage pit, adapting the dimensions and materials to what was available and practical at the individual household level. This transfer of practical knowledge between contexts is not a dramatic act. It does not look like innovation from the outside. It looks like a man digging a hole that is 3 feet deeper than anyone else's hole, which is why his neighbors called it unnecessary. The broader context of food storage in medieval England helps to understand both why Edmund's knowledge was valuable and why it was not already in general practice. Monasteries, manorial granaries, and the larger merchant operations that supplied grain to urban markets had developed systematic approaches to the problem of keeping food through winter. These institutions stored at scale, and losses at scale, were economically significant enough to justify investment in better methods. A monastery that lost 30% of its grain stores to bad storage conditions lost enough food to feed a significant part of its dependent population through the winter. The economic pressure to find better methods was real and sustained, and it had produced genuinely better methods over time. The individual peasant household operated in a different situation. A family storing enough roots and grain to survive one winter faced the same physical problems as a large institution, but with much less surplus to absorb losses and much less time and labor to invest in infrastructure. The standard 2-foot pit was not an irrational response to those constraints. It was the minimum adequate solution for a normal year. And normal years were what the system was designed around. The problem with designing around normal years is that abnormal years occur regularly. A winter severe enough to break the standard storage method happened, in southern England in the 13th century, roughly every 6 to 10 years based on what the historical record suggests about the climate of the period. This was frequent enough to cause repeated crises, but infrequent enough that the memory of the previous crisis had faded by the time the next one arrived. Each hard winter was treated as an exceptional event, rather than as evidence of a systematic vulnerability. Edmund had an advantage that his neighbors did not. He had spent 4 winters observing storage methods that were designed for institutional rather than household scale, and he had worked with a man who had thought systematically about the problem over a long career. Brother Anselm had seen many abnormal winters, and he had adjusted his methods in response to what he observed. Edmund had absorbed those adjustments without having to discover them himself through the expensive experience of failure. When he applied them in Ashford, the knowledge arrived in the village already tested and refined. The 20 days Edmund spent digging and building were not 20 days of experimentation. They were 20 days of implementing a method whose results he had already watched across multiple winters. By the harvest of 1248, 6 households in Ashford had dug pits using at least a modified version of Edmund's method. 2 had built the full construction to the correct depth and with the clay seal. 4 had compromised at 4 feet and used a closer fitted lid without the full clay seal. The reeve had constructed a new storage facility for the Lord's domain produce using the specifications from the monastery records, which he had requested and received as a result of the entry in his memorandum book. The harvest of 1248 was a good one. The late planting had been compensated by a long, warm autumn, and the yields from the common strips were above average. This meant that the improved storage capacity went into its first full year carrying more food than the previous year's damaged pits had held. The village entered the winter of 1248 in a materially better position than it had entered 1247. That winter was mild by the standards of the period, a normal English winter, cold but not killing, with frosts that did not last long enough to penetrate deep soil. The improved pits performed well, as they would have performed even without the improvements in those conditions. This created a situation that Edmund recognized and said nothing about publicly. A mild winter following a hard one tends to confirm whatever people did differently after the hard winter, whether or not the different thing was actually responsible for the better outcome. The 6 households that had built improved pits attributed their successful storage to the new method. They were correct in the sense that the method was genuinely better, but they could not have demonstrated this on the basis of the mild winter of 1248 alone, because the standard pits had also come through that winter adequately. The real test had been 1247. The lesson was available to anyone who had been paying attention, but the mild following year made it easy not to. Robert, who had lost heavily in 1248 and rebuilt his pit with Edmund's help that spring, kept his improved construction regardless of the mild winter. He had direct experience of the cost of the old method and was not going to abandon the new one on the basis of one good season. His improved pit became the standard for his household for the rest of his working life. The reeve continued to recommend the method to any new households and to any estates he corresponded with. The entry in his memorandum book was copied at least once, as evidenced by a similar description appearing in an estate management document from a different manor in the Chilterns about 15 years later, which refers to a storage method adopted from a neighboring village without naming the source. The practical consequences of better root vegetable storage in a medieval peasant household extended beyond the obvious reduction in food shortages during hard winters. The seed grain question mattered most, A peasant family that ran short of food in February faced a choice that had no good resolution. They could eat the grain reserved for spring planting, survive the winter, and have no seed for the following year's crops. Or they could protect the seed grain, go hungry, and risk the health consequences of sustained malnutrition. Families in the first position borrowed seed from the Lord or from neighbors with resources to spare, creating obligations that could not always be met, and that reduced the family's economic position for years afterward. Families in the second position sometimes did not survive until spring planting and adequate health to work the fields. Edmund's family had avoided this choice in 1248 because they had sufficient stored roots to eat adequately through February without touching the seed grain. The value of this was not just the absence of hunger, it was the absence of the debt and obligation that accompanied emergency support. And it was the maintenance of the seed stock that would determine the following year's harvest. The health dimension was also significant. Sustained malnutrition in late winter reduces resistance to illness, and illness in late winter in a village of tightly housed families spreads efficiently. The concentration of respiratory and gastrointestinal diseases in the late winter months of bad years is visible in the mortality records of the period. Families with adequate food through February were in a materially different position with respect to illness risk than families that had been on reduced rations for several weeks before the first signs of spring. Edmund's 3 daughters, born in 1247, 1243, and 1240, all survived the winter of 1248. Child mortality in hard medieval winters was not exclusively or even primarily a function of storage methods, and any single family's survival cannot be attributed to one cause. But the material conditions that supported survival included having enough food, and Edmund had addressed that condition with the tools available to him. The transmission of practical agricultural knowledge in medieval England happened through channels that left few records. The written documentation that survives is dominated by the records of large institutions, primarily monasteries and large manors, which had administrators and scribes and reasons to maintain written instructions. Individual peasant households operated entirely through oral transmission and direct demonstration. This creates a distortion in how the history looks from the outside. We can read the monastery's granary records because the monastery kept records. We cannot read the knowledge that Edmund transmitted to Robert across the strip boundary because nobody wrote it down, and the 2 men could not have written it themselves. The knowledge that spread through Ashford in 1248, and from Ashford into surrounding villages in the following years, is visible only in its downstream effects. The modified storage methods visible in archaeological excavation of later medieval village sites. The gradual standardization of deeper pit dimensions in manorial management documents from the late 13th century onward, and the disappearance of emergency grain distributions as a regular feature of estate accounts in areas where improved methods had spread. These changes did not happen because of Edmund specifically. They happened because the problem of winter food storage had a better solution than the one in general practice, and when people with direct economic reasons to find that solution encountered it, they adopted it. Edmund was not the only person who knew the monastery's methods. He was probably not the only person who had tried to apply them at the household level. He was one of several entry points through which institutional knowledge moved into village practice, What distinguished his case was the combination of timing and evidence. He built his improved pit in the year before a hard winter. The hard winter came. The evidence was unambiguous. In a mild year, his neighbors would have seen the extra work and concluded it was unnecessary. The winter of 1247 to 1248 made the argument for him. The principle that Edmund had applied was straightforward. Temperature stability is the primary requirement for winter food storage. Fluctuations in temperature, not simply cold, are what cause stored roots to fail. A storage environment that holds steady at just above freezing for the entire winter will preserve root vegetables far more effectively than one that follows the surface temperature up and down with every change in the weather. Depth achieves this because the Earth itself is a massive thermal buffer. The planet's interior heat, moving up through the rock and soil, maintains the deep ground at a temperature that does not respond quickly to surface conditions. At 5 feet, the winter temperature in English chalk country is stable enough that the daily and weekly variations of the surface climate are effectively invisible. The pit floor maintains roughly the same temperature, whether it is November or February, whether the surface is frozen or briefly thawing. Mass reinforces this. A pit lined with clay has more thermal inertia than one lined with loose straw. When the outside temperature drops, the clay lining absorbs the drop more slowly than straw does. The temperature inside the pit lags behind the outside temperature by longer when there is more mass to change. This lag, which seems like a small thing, is the difference between partial freezing and full protection across a sustained cold period. Sealing the lid prevents the most direct path of temperature exchange, which is air movement. A loose-fitting cover lets cold air fall into the pit and warm air escape. Over the course of 40 days of sustained freeze, this exchange can reduce the pit's interior temperature significantly. A tight seal removes this pathway almost entirely. The small air vent that Edmund fitted was not a contradiction of this principle. It was a management tool, open briefly when conditions permitted to refresh the air without compromising the thermal protection, and kept plugged when the outside temperature was below the desired interior range. These principles were not mysterious. They had been understood and applied at the institutional scale for generations. The gap was between the knowledge held by people who managed large-scale storage facilities and the knowledge and practice in individual households. That gap was maintained partly by social distance and partly by the economic logic that made the standard 2-foot pit adequate in most years. Edmund closed the gap for his household first and then for others, through the combination of his own experience, the knowledge he had absorbed at Abingdon, and the willingness to spend 20 days on work that nobody around him thought was necessary. The Reeves memorandum note ended with a practical calculation that summarized the economics as he understood them. The additional labor cost of building a proper deep storage pit was roughly 8 days of one man's work above the standard method. The emergency grain provided to the village in February of 1248 had cost the Lord's Reserve enough grain to feed 4 families for 2 months. Distributed across the households that had required it, the grain cost per household was significantly more than the labor cost of building one improved pit. The note concluded that the investment was worth making. This was the argument that had the most immediate effect on the rate at which the method spread. The reeve was not persuaded by principles of temperature physics. He was persuaded by a comparison of labor costs against emergency grain costs, which was a calculation he could do with the numbers directly in front of him. In the winter of 1252, 4 years after the killing winter, Ashford experienced another hard, cold season. Not as severe as 1248, but sustained enough to test whatever storage methods the village had adopted in the interval. The manorial accounts for that year record no emergency grain distribution to the village. The improved pits, present in roughly half the households by that point, provided sufficient protection for their owners. The households that had not adopted the improved method experienced losses, but the overall village food position was substantially better than it would have been if the 1247 construction had never taken place. Robert, whose new pit was now in its 4th winter, opened it in February of 1253 to take his weak supply of roots, and noted in a conversation recorded in the priest's house book, as part of a legal matter unrelated to storage, that his pit had come through the winter without loss. The priest noted this because Robert was making a point about property and the value of improvements, not because the priest was recording agricultural history. The detail survives because the legal matter required it. Edmund was not mentioned in the priest's record. The knowledge had passed from him to Robert, and by that point belonged to the village's collective practice, rather than to its originator. The reeve's memorandum book was at the monastery. Edmund himself continued working his strips in Ashford into the 1260s, by which point his oldest daughter had married into a family in a neighboring village and had presumably carried the knowledge with her in the ordinary way that families transmit what they know. The pit itself, or the soil pattern of it, may still be present below the current fields at the site of the medieval village of Ashford, depending on what has been built and disturbed there since the 13th century. Archaeological excavation of medieval village sites in England has documented the evolution of storage pit construction over the period, including the shift toward deeper, better-lined pits that occurred in the late 13th century. Whether any particular pit in that pattern traces back to one man's decision to keep digging in October of 1247 is not recoverable. What is recoverable is the logic. The problem was known. The solution was available. The barrier between them was the gap between institutional knowledge and household practice. And the moment that gap closed for one household in one village, the knowledge had a path into general circulation. The emergency grain record of 1248, the reeve's memorandum note, the priest's house book entry of 1253, and the absence of any subsequent emergency distribution in Ashford's manorial records are the traces of that path. Edmund lived to see the method he had brought from Abingdon become the standard practice in his corner of the Chilterns. He did not write this down, and it was not written about him. The old people in the village in the 1270s, when they were being interviewed about local customs for a manorial survey, described the deep pit method as something that had always been done in Ashford. They had no memory of a time when it had been considered unnecessary work. This is the ordinary way that practical knowledge moves through communities. It arrives, it is tested, it works, it is adopted, and within a generation it becomes invisible because it is simply what people do. The man who introduced it is forgotten because the knowledge no longer needs him. It belongs to the place rather than to the person. His granddaughter, working the strips in Ashford in the early 14th century, dug her storage pit to 5 feet without thinking much about why. It was the right depth. Everyone knew that. There had always been a proper way to do it and a careless way to do it. And the proper way was 5 feet with a clay seal and a fitted lid, her grandmother had told her, and her grandmother had learned from her father. And that was the end of the traceable line. The principle survived even after the details were forgotten. A properly dug pit does not fail in a hard winter. The work done in October is recovered in February. What looks like excessive preparation at the beginning of the season looks like bare adequacy by the end of it. This is not a lesson that requires writing down. It is the kind of lesson that survives because the consequences of ignoring it arrive reliably and are expensive enough to be remembered. Edmund had known this in October of 1247, standing at the edge of his 5-foot hole while his neighbors watched from their doorways and called out that he was wasting his time. He did not argue with them. He went back to digging.